In December 2017, I found myself standing on the courthouse steps in Charleston, South Carolina, after what was arguably the biggest victory of my career. A police officer had been found guilty of the murder of Walter Scott and had been sentenced to one of the longest sentences ever given to a police officer for the killing of civilians. The leading newspaper in South Carolina called it a monumental day for civil rights. But as I stood on the courthouse steps, I felt empty. I felt empty because I knew that no matter what, Walter Scott wasn't coming back. I knew that in the 2.5 years it had taken to investigate and prosecute that case, over 2,500 other people had died in confrontations with the police. And I knew that no matter what, the policies and systems and procedures that contributed to Walter Scott's death were going to be in place the very next day. When you feel that way after the biggest victory of your career, it's time to get a new job. After over 20 years of working in the American criminal justice system, I had come to a realization. Our system wasn't designed to achieve justice. In fact, it wasn't even designed to achieve public safety or even accountability. Our system was designed to achieve punishment. And one thing that I have learned over the course of my career is that we should never confuse punishment for justice or for public safety. But it's important to realize that this system was built by people. And if we choose, we can redesign our system so that it can more effectively achieve public safety, justice, and accountability in our communities. And so I began to wonder, what would it take to redesign our justice system? As I was struggling with that question, I got a phone call. I got a phone call from Solicitor Scarlett Wilson, the chief prosecutor in Charleston, South Carolina. I'd worked with Scarlett on the Walter Scott case. Scarlett had begun to recognize that within her own system, there were systems and structures that were often leading to unequal results. And so I wondered, in this new age of technology and data, could we use this data to help improve justice outcomes? The first part of the Justice Innovation Lab approach is to define the purpose. In Charleston, South Carolina, the goal was to make their system more fair and effective. They had collected lots of data on their decision making, but the question was where to start. What they knew quite clearly was their purpose. They wanted their system to be more fair and effective. And I knew that I wanted to spend the next part of my career helping Charleston and other communities get to the bottom of this question. Can we use data to make the system more fair and effective? I had read the book Moneyball, which tells the story of a mid-market baseball team that uses data analytics to win more games. And I thought to myself, if the Oakland A's can make it to the championship on the basis of data analytics, perhaps we could use data to make our justice system more fair and effective. And so I left the Justice Department and founded Justice Innovation Lab. But as a next step, I needed to learn something about data. First, it only works if you have reliable data to work with. And second, it only really matters if you're counting the right things. Early in my career, I worked at the U.S. State Department, and that was the first time I had ever seen data and metrics being used in decision-making. At the time, I was working on post-war rule of law reconstruction in Iraq. And we had a number of metrics to try to evaluate whether or not we were achieving the rule of law. My favorite metric that we used was the number of courthouses built. Now, what I came to learn is that is a terrible metric for figuring out whether or not we're actually contributing to the rule of law. In the American criminal justice system, for years, we have only used two metrics to measure whether or not we are being successful. First, the number of convictions that we get, and second, the number of years of incarceration that someone gets. Now, I've come to realize that these two metrics tell us something about our justice system, but they are a far cry from being a successful metric on whether or not our system is being fair and effective. The reality is that we could count anything. One thing we could ask is whether or not victims of crime, the people that our system is set up to serve, how they feel about our performance. Because when we do, what we find is that victims of crime are overwhelmingly dissatisfied with the current process. 60% of people who have been victimized do not even report their victimization to law enforcement, opting out of the system entirely. I think we should count whether or not we are being effective with the most serious crimes that our communities face, like homicides and sexual assaults and violent armed carjackings. And when we look at these numbers, we're often dismayed. Across the country, police are solving less than half of all homicides. Those numbers are even worse when we look at non-fatal shootings, where the numbers often drop below 25%. How can our system be effective if we are not solving the most important crimes that communities face? Another thing that we should count are the number of people who are interacting with our system every year. Every year in America, approximately 10 million arrests take place. Most of those people are arrested for nonviolent, low-level offenses. Many of the people entering our system are suffering from mental health challenges, from substance abuse, from poverty, and from trauma. And a real question that we need to ask ourselves is, are those people better served in our system or through alternatives? One number I think we should also count is the number of years of incarceration that are sentenced every year. In one jurisdiction that we worked at, we added all of the sentences that they had done over the course of a year. Everything from the 1-day sentences to the 5-day to the 2-year to the 100-year sentences. And we added up all of those numbers to figure out how many years of incarceration people were being sentenced to every year. In that one particular jurisdiction, a small one, the jurisdiction was sentencing people to over 4,000 years per year. Now, that number matters from a human level, from the number of people who will be taken out of society for a substantially long period of time, impacting not only the arrestees themselves, but their families, their children. But another thing that number tells us is how much money each jurisdiction is spending on incarceration. In South Carolina, for example, the jurisdiction spends $40,000 for every year of incarceration. In California, that number is even higher, $130,000 every year. And so I think jurisdictions should be counting how many years are we sentencing people every year, so we can determine, is that the best way to spend taxpayer dollars? Is there a better way that we can use this money to serve our communities and address underlying problems, such as mental health and substance abuse? When we started working in Charleston, we looked at lots of different things that we could count. One of the things that we looked at was how many cases were being dismissed for insufficient evidence. Every year, prosecutors review the work of police and have to make a decision. Does this case meet our legal obligations? Can we prove a crime beyond a reasonable doubt? Do the facts of this case meet the elements of the crime? Can we meet our obligation to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? What we found in looking at Charleston's data was that 1 in 4 of their cases were being dismissed because of insufficient evidence. 1 in 4. A significant amount of resources, police resources, prosecutorial resources, were being spent on cases that would never make it to court. Now, that problem from a resource perspective, from an effectiveness perspective, was bad enough. But as we delved into the numbers, what we saw was that it was taking the jurisdiction over 220 days to come to that decision. 220 days to recognize that a case should not be in the system and remove it from the system. Now, during that time, some of those people were detained in jail. Many of those people lost their jobs. Virtually all of them had to pay a bond. The second part of the Justice Innovation Lab approach is to make sure that we are counting the right things. When a community has decided what their purpose is, what they think the purpose of the justice system should be, we've got to make sure that we are measuring the things that can determine whether or not we are achieving our goals, whether or not we are being fair and effective. Now, when Charleston, South Carolina realized that 1 in 4 of their cases were being dismissed and that it was taking them a substantially long time, with implications both for arrestees and for law enforcement, they decided they wanted to do something about it. So the third part of the Justice Innovation Lab process is to deconstruct the system. A major component of our work at Justice Innovation Lab involves systems thinking. One of the reasons why I like systems thinking is it gives us an entirely new language to talk about what is happening day in and day out at a macro level. Oftentimes in law enforcement and in law in general, we focused on individual cases, the specific facts and their application to the law and what would be just in an individual case. With data, it allows us to back up to a 50,000-foot level and look at the system holistically, to step away from individual decision making and look at the systemic processes that are involved, leading to outcomes. And so we lean into systems thinking as a way to gain new language to talk about what is problematic in our interactions. So first, what is a system? A system is an interconnected set of elements designed to achieve a purpose. Now, as you can tell, that is a rather broad definition, and it would apply to many groups of interconnected things: a justice system, an educational system, a study group, a family. All of these things, when they are organized to achieve a purpose, become a system. What I love about that is that means that we can use this type of thinking not only to solve the macro problems of the American criminal justice system, but also systemic problems that we see in our daily lives and our families. When thinking about the American criminal justice system, it's important to ask ourselves, what is its purpose? Is its purpose to punish? Is its purpose to achieve justice? Is its purpose to achieve public safety? Is its purpose to achieve accountability? If we really think about what we want the purpose of our justice system to be, I'm fairly certain that most people would agree our system as it is designed today is not designed to achieve that purpose. So what does it look like to be more fair? In Charleston, they thought it was unfair to have 1 in 4 cases dismissed for insufficient evidence. They thought it was unfair that people were often stuck in the system for over 220 days who shouldn't be there. When you realize that your system is working in a way that is not achieving your purpose, what do you do about it? In systems thinking, we have a saying that systems are perfectly designed to achieve the results they are currently achieving. And so when you look at outcomes in a system, when the data that you are counting is leading to results that you don't think are right, what do you do about it? Well, in Charleston, when they saw that 1 in 4 cases were being dismissed for insufficient evidence, they began using systems thinking to help them with that approach. Another thing that's important to know about systems is that systems are not the sum of their parts, but they're the product of their interactions. And so if we want to fix a system, if we want to achieve different outcomes that are more aligned with our purpose, then it starts by understanding the interactions of the component parts of the system so that we get the results that we are hoping to achieve. One of the examples that we used in Charleston was around the simple bathtub. Now, as many of you probably have experienced before, a bathtub works like this. First, you want to control the temperature of the water. We control how hot it is or how cold it is by using the different faucets to determine the temperature. You want to get the bathtub just the right amount of water in it at a certain level. If we've put too much in, we need to let it out. If we need more, we add more in. And so we started by using this approach, which everyone understood, to talk about massive case backlogs in the system, to talk about how these backlogs contributed to the amount of time it took to resolve a case, and more importantly, helped focus everyone's attention on key leverage points that could be used to fix the system. What does that look like for the criminal justice system? They looked at inputs. They looked at how many good cases were coming in and how many bad cases were coming in. They looked at different ways that they could get cases out of the system, such as through pleas, through trials, through dismissals, or through diversionary choices. So why was it taking over 220 days? When they began looking at how a case entered the system and how it was assigned, they quickly began to realize that the process through which a case moved was unnecessarily long, that there was no one focusing on that question of whether or not it was a good case or a bad case. And no one had the responsibility to remove those bad cases from the system in a timely manner. They were overflowing with information. They were overflowing with cases. And with that pressure, they were failing to serve their community in the way they wanted to, and so they decided to do something about it. So step 3 of the Justice Innovation Lab process is to deconstruct the system. When we do that, we see opportunities to make the system better. Key leverage points. What are the items that are causing us backlogs? What is happening in terms of feedback loops between key partners? We can find the opportunities where small actions can have a huge impact. We look at things like default settings. What is the default assumption of how a case or a matter is going to be handled? We look at bottlenecks. What are the parts of the system that are taking too long, and what can we do to make the process flow more effectively? How are component parts giving each other feedback? Are they doing it in a way that makes the process better, or are they doing it in a way that makes the process work? The fourth part of Justice Innovation Lab's approach is about taking a hypothesis mindset. What is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is an idea that can be tested. And when you're collecting the right data, and when you're counting the right things, you can choose data points that can validate whether or not your hypothesis is correct. In working in Charleston, they had numerous hypotheses on what was causing the delays. Sometimes they believed it was caused by the number of defense counsel that might have been assigned. They thought that some of the delays might be caused by the types of charges or by the criminal history of the defendant. One of the main hypotheses was that case assignment was leading to unnecessary delays in decision-making, and that by moving the decision earlier in the process and by assigning a prosecutor with the idea specifically of removing legally insufficient cases from the system, we could identify more cases that should not be in the system and that we could do it faster. Charleston, not wanting to make a wholesale change to their process without testing it, set up a pilot project. They assigned a senior prosecutor whose job was to review a subset of cases coming in and to decide whether or not the case was legally sufficient. What our pilot project found was that he was able to remove more cases from the system and do it substantially faster. And so Charleston decided to expand the pilot, adding an extra full-time prosecutor to help with that process, adding more charges and more police departments to their project. And over time, they flipped the script. Now, more cases are being removed from the system every month than are coming in, substantially shrinking the backlog inside the office and allowing the prosecutors to focus their time and attention on the highest priority cases for that jurisdiction. Cases are being resolved hundreds of days faster than the status quo. Hundreds of people who were otherwise stuck in the system have now been removed from the system. The fifth part of the Justice Innovation Lab approach is that we meet people where they're at. We recognize that lots of people who want to build more fair and just communities come at this from different places and perspectives. In one jurisdiction we worked with, we did a project involving racial narratives, trying to understand how it is that certain narratives find their way into our system. Now, all of these pictures that we showed people had come from a period of time before any of us were born, and so none of us were responsible for those things. But we asked all of the prosecutors, when you look at these pictures, when you see the harm that's done, what narratives were being told that enabled this to take place? When we looked at data for that jurisdiction, we saw that not only was it taking a long time for cases to be resolved, but there were often inequalities based on the race of the defendant. It was taking substantially longer for cases to be resolved for black defendants than for white defendants. We asked the prosecutors, why might that be? What stories might we be telling ourselves that can help explain the differences in outcomes? And one of the prosecutors raised his hands and said, maybe I'm taking longer to dismiss a case for black defendants because I'm telling myself a story that black defendants are more criminal, that they are more dangerous. Well, following that training, all the prosecutors went back to their office and reviewed their cases and found, yes, there were a lot of cases that should be dismissed today. To me, this is a great example of what happens when we meet people where they're at. They begin to understand their systems, they can begin to test new hypotheses, and they can begin to see how their actions contribute to the harm they are trying to prevent. And it makes it possible to reimagine solutions to problems that have been hiding in plain sight. The approach that we've been taking at Justice Innovation Lab has been well received around the country. South Carolina's leading paper called it a common sense, we can't believe this isn't already being done approach. We think that more and more jurisdictions are hungry for common sense solutions to solve some of the biggest problems in our justice system. So, let's take it back one more time. What is our approach? Number one, identify the purpose. Understand what you are hoping to achieve inside your justice system. Number two, make sure you're counting the right things. Make sure you're doing it with accurate information and making sure that those metrics actually reflect the objectives you're trying to achieve. Number three, deconstruct the system. Understand the component parts of your system, understand their relationships with each other and how the interactions between those parts are leading to unwanted outcomes. They provide us leverage points to begin to fix our problems. Number four, approach change with a hypothesis mindset. Come to change with a bit of humility. Understand that our ideas might not always be accurate. When our approach isn't working, we need to find opportunities to pivot, to iterate, to make sure that we are in fact achieving our objectives. And finally, the fifth part, meet people where they're at. Our world has been suffering from immense injustices for a very long time, and this system was built by people. But if we can meet people where they're at, who recognize that our system is not working the way it should, then we will find the solutions that we need to make our communities more fair and just. At Justice Innovation Lab, we believe that our approach starts by understanding the world as it is, imagining the world as it could be, and then doing justice. So thank you for joining Justice Innovation Lab in our efforts to build a more fair and effective justice system. Now go out into the world and do justice.